If you want to learn how to use NextImage component to achieve better core web vitals and ultimately a better user experience, or if you have had difficulty taming NextImage component to work the way you want it to, this video is for you. Hi, my name is Hamid and welcome to the party. I've condensed everything that I learned working with NextImage component in a single blog post on my site, and I'm going to include a link in the description below so you can follow along. And basically it is a summary of what I found in NextJs documentation. So it's nothing proprietary to me, it's just my understanding of the documentation. Now I've also created a standard NextJS app so we can implement what we are kind of learning here into an actual app and see the results. Now, to get started, the image component is an extension of the HTML tag with some built-in performance optimization. For example, it serves the correct size and format depending on the user device. So it has improved performance already. It also prevents cumulative layout shift, which is when the browser does not know the size of your images in advance, and it results in the pages jumping up and down as the images are loaded. Now it also results in faster page load because by default the image component loads images lazily, in the sense that the images, if they're not in the viewport, they won't be loaded. Also, there is this blur up option you can set that would show a blurred version of your image first while the actual image is loading, all of which will result in a faster page load for your users. Now, to add an image component to your application, you need to import it from NextJS like so, and you have to set some props for it. There are some required props, primarily 3 required props: source, width, and height. What is source? Well, the source is the source of the image, like the image element or tag in HTML. It can be one of two things. It's either a statically imported image. So for example, here I'm statically importing an image from my public folder. So in the public folder of my application, as you can see here, I have a bunch of images and I am importing one of them statically over here, and I'm passing it as the source to my image component. If I go to the page on my site, you can see it's the image of this beautiful bike that I love over here. And I'm also showing this actual size of the image, which is 960 by 540 pixels. The second way of including a source is a string, a path string, which can be either an absolute URL to an external image or an internal path, depending on the loader prop or the loader configuration settings for your images, which we're going to touch on shortly. Now, what is width? Width is the width of the image in pixels without any units, and you need to provide width unless you have either statically imported your image, as I have done here. As you can see here, I have not set the width, even though I said width is a required prop. So if you have statically imported your images, you don't need to set the width, because NextJS automatically has access to the image, analyzes the image, and derives the width and the height from it. The other option where you don't need to pass a width is when you set the layout to fill. We're going to talk about the layout property that you could set or pass to your image components, and different options or values you can set. But in 2 instances, you don't need to provide a width or a height. The first is that when you're statically importing your image, as I'm doing here, and the second instance is where you have set the layout to fill. In all other cases, you have to set the width and height of your image. Now, for local images, these are the images that you're statically importing. NextJS automatically, as I mentioned, determines the width and the height of your image based on the imported file. These values are used to prevent the cumulative layout shift while your images are loading. So because the size is specified in advance, the browser is able to account for that size before the images are fully loaded. So therefore, when they are, the layout doesn't shift. As you can see here is an example of how you're using the image component with a source. And in the comments, you could see width is not needed because it's automatically provided. The height is not needed again because it's automatically provided. And there's another thing that's automatically provided, and that's the blur data URL. We're going to talk about this later on when we're setting a placeholder for our image to show a blurred version of our image. This blur data, if you're statically importing your image, is going to be automatically provided by NextJS. Now, remote images are images that are not statically imported. So the URL would be the string, the path, which can be either relative or absolute, as I mentioned. Now, when it is relative, it depends on the loader props or configuration of your images, which we're going to touch on. But because NextJS does not have access to these files during the build process, it does not know the width and the height, so you need to pass them. Okay, so if you're using an image over here, if you could see here, I no longer am importing any image statically, and I am passing a string path to my source, which is /me.png. And because this is not a statically imported image, I need to provide the width and the height. Now, sometimes you may want to access a remote image, maybe living on your CDN, but still would like to use the built-in NextJS image optimizations. For that, all you need to do is pass an external absolute URL of your image and then leave the loader options as default. Again, we're going to talk about loaders in a second. Now, when you are specifying an external URL to protect your application from malicious users, you need to pass in safe domains to your next config.js. So there on the images, you would pass in all the domains where your images would live. Here you can see cdn.example.com. Now let's talk about loaders. What are loaders? Now, in the example that you see here, before I passed an absolute URL, I was including a relative URL over here. What allowed me to do this is using a loader. So in the example earlier, a partial URL, this guy, was provided for a remote image. This is because of the next image loader. A loader is a function that generates the URL for your images. It appends a root domain to your provided source, which was this /me.png, and generates multiple URLs to fetch that image at different sizes, so that those images or URLs are then used in the source set of your image element. So as you can see here, we are including a loader function which takes in some properties about the source and the width and the quality of the image that we need, and it kind of appends a root to our source, includes some options to fetch different qualities and sizes of our image. And as you can see here, I'm passing this loader function as a prop to my loader image. Loaders can be defined per image or at the application level. And if you define a loader at the image level, it will override the application level. Now let's see what built-in loaders NextJS come with. So there's a default, as we mentioned earlier, that works with NextDev and NextStart. So in your development environment and your production environment. And it works automatically when you deploy on Vercel. There's other built-in loaders configured to work with ImageIX, Cloudinary, Akamai. Custom loader, you would set the loader to custom, and then you would use a custom cloud provider by implementing the loader prop on the next image component. So in this version that I did, that I'm using a custom loader function, so I'm using the loader prop, and I will go ahead and set my loader to custom. Example here, you can see loader Cloudinary. You have to specify a path, which is your root domain. Now the loader will generate URLs for your images. it appends this root domain, which is the path that we specified here, to the partial URL we set as the source of our image. So the example that I had before, if this is the setting that I'm using at the application level, would be HTTPS cloudinary my account, and it will add some configurations to fetch different sizes and different formats. And then the me.png is the part that we partially included in our source in the image. Image sizing. So your images or next image component needs to be sized in one of three ways. It's either automatic, when you're statically importing your image, NextJS will automatically define the size. You have to either set the size explicitly using the width and height, which we mentioned earlier, or you can set the size implicitly by setting the layout prop to fill, which then expands the image to fill the container or the parent. And the idea is that if you have to then have a fixed size on the parent, so if you don't know the size of the image, you will set it to fill the container, and assuming that your parent, your container has, or your wrapper has a set size, it will solve the problem. Let's talk about the layout prop we mentioned a couple of times. The layout prop defines how your image will behave when the viewport size change. It can be one of four possible values: intrinsic, responsive, fill, or fixed. By default, it is intrinsic, which means that the image will scale down to fit the width of the container, but does not scale up beyond the actual size of the image. To see this in action, let's actually go to our page and let's put some outline around our div over here. So let's give it a nice color of cyan 400. Okay, so as you can see here, my div, which wraps this image, which acts as the container of this image, is actually bigger than the initial size of the image. As we explained, the intrinsic value, which is the default because we haven't set any layout over here, makes the image to scale down to fit the width of the container, but does not scale up beyond the original image dimensions. So it does not expand or scale up, but if I reduce the screen size, as you can see, the image is continuing to scale down to fit the container div, which is shrinking. Now, if you're wondering about this white space underneath this image, image elements overall have a display of inline block, and usually you would see this kind of gap, white space underneath regular HTML image tags as well. And to solve it in regular HTML, you would just set the display of your image elements to block, and it would get rid of this. It won't work quite the same for image components, but there's a trick you can do on this wrapper component by setting this. So if you set a style tag of setting the letter spacing to 0 and the font size to 0, it will get rid of that. And another thing that I have seen set is the word spacing. So if you set these three properties, it usually gets rid of that space over there. But nevertheless, the intrinsic layout property, as you can see, it scales down, but it does not scale up beyond the actual image size, which is 720 pixels wide here. Now, the second value for your layout property is responsive. In the responsive mode, it scales up or down to fit the container width. So I'm going to set a layout prop over here, and I'm going to pass responsive. Now, as you can see, as I change it to responsive, it just scaled up to fit the width of the container. So the difference between responsive and intrinsic is that intrinsic only scales down to shrink and not up beyond the original dimensions of the image. In the responsive, it scales up or down to fit the width of the container. Next one, fill. It grows in both width and height to fill the container. So stretch both the width and the height to the dimensions of the parent element. This is usually paired with the object fit property and object position property to avoid distorting the image. But before we get to those two properties, let's actually examine how fill works. So if I set the value of layout to fill right now, it fills the whole page. One thing you need to remember about the fill value of the layout is that you have to set the position of the parent to relative. So the parent is this div right now, and I need to position this relatively by passing in relative. Now when I pass relative, I no longer now see anything. So it's not covering my page, but I don't see the image either. Remember, fill, what it does is that it's for the time that we don't know the size of our image and we want it to just fill the parent, scale up or down both on the width and the height, and that's how it differs from responsive, because responsive was also scaling up and down, but responsive only works on the width. But fill works on the width and the height to stretch to fill the container. Therefore, the container needs to have specific width and height. Otherwise, nothing will be shown here. So let's actually set some specific size on the parent. Now, as you can see, I gave it 384 pixel by 384 pixel, and I've turned this into a square. And because the layout fill is trying to both scale the width and the height to fit the parent, it has actually distorted the image. This is where those extra properties that I mentioned, the object fit, you could say cover, this is the exact object fit in CSS property. It crops the image instead of squishing it. And you also have the object position, which determines where actually the crop is happening, or what to keep. Maybe left. Yeah, you see here. And that was the layout fill. The last value is fixed, in which the image dimensions will not change, so it won't be responsive. And this is similar to the native image element. Now, other props that you can set on the image component, such as size, quality, you can read through it. It's pretty straightforward. One thing I'll mention is this priority, because images or the image component by default implements lazy loading to your images. If your image is above fold, meaning that when the page loads, it's in the viewport, you shouldn't lazy load the image. That's not a good user experience. So you would set your priority prop here, which disables the lazy loading for this specific image. So for example, in our case, we are dealing with an image that's in the viewport when the page loads, so it needs to be not lazily loaded. The placeholder is used while the image is loading. It can either be blur or empty, and it defaults to empty. So if you don't put in any placeholder while the image is loading, this space is empty. The size is specific, so you won't see a layout shift, but it's just a white space. Optionally, you can pass in blur, and for blur you need a blur data URL, which is a URL of a placeholder image. So while the actual image is loading, you can show a blurred version of your image, and it should be a small sized image, so that the user can see something while the image is being loaded. Now, when you're statically importing your images like I'm doing here, this blur data URL is also automatically provided to us. So there is a lot of benefit when you're statically importing your images. The width and the height, you no longer need them. Next.js will automatically drive that for you. It also automatically provides this data URL. So if I set the placeholder over here to be blur, and if I go back, you can see right now that my image is blurred up. If I refresh, it was kind of holded there. That's not the way that it should work, but it was good to actually show. So if I throttle my network and load again, you can see before the image loads, you should see a blurred image first and then the image itself. Yeah, it happens very fast, but you set the placeholder to blur, and because I am statically importing my image, this is automatically provided for me by Next.js. Otherwise, I have to pass a URL myself, which needs to be a base 64 encoded image, a small image. So that it works. Object fit and object position are the properties that we use with the layout field, and these are the CSS object field and object position. So when we are cropping the image, we know the fit and the position we are cropping the image to. Now, styling image components aren't that different from normal image elements, but there are some guidelines to keep in mind. First of all, pick the correct layout. Sometimes changing the layout will do the job for you. If you wanted to pass in some classes and style your images, don't target the image based on the DOM structure. Just pass in classes to this image component, and this will pass those classes to the image element inside. Now, one thing to note though is you can't use this style property because the image component does not actually pass the style properties you set on the image component down to the image element. Now, keep in mind, when you're using layout field, your parent component needs to be position relative. And when you're using layout responsive, the parent element needs to be a block element. Well, this was a div, which is by default a block level element, and we didn't need to specifically set it here. But if you're using an element like a span that's not a block level element by default, you need to make sure that you sets the display to block on the parent, on the wrapper, on the container when you're using layout responsive. And responsive was when your image was scaling up and down to fit the width of the container. Now, this was everything you needed to know to work with Next Image Component. If you learned anything from this video, consider subscribing to my channel. It really helps supporting me in creating content like this, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.